Hey guys, Toby Vance here, Lost History of Eden, coming to you with the new video today. This is the third in our series on the existence of God on our religious side of the spectrum, trying to take a look at establishing different evidence and proof for the existence of a divine being, of a God. If you haven't checked out my other videos yet, make sure you check out the video considerations. That's the video that kind of lays the groundwork for what we're doing here. And it goes into a better explanation of the two sides of the spectrum we're looking at here when we try to merge science with the Bible, try to merge archaeology with the Bible. What we want to do is we want to make sure our science is as true to form as possible, but we also don't want to ignore the Bible, the existence of God in interpreting history and archaeology if God exists. And so we've already done our series on the science side, establishing that evolution's true. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old, in contradiction to the creation scientists and the things that they teach, that the Earth is 6,000 years old and everything was created instantly. We're establishing that viewpoint is not really a good solid one as a basis for starting an examination of the Bible and science. So now we're establishing the other side, the side going against the skeptics and the atheists and the critical scholars, that there is a God, that the Bible has some legitimacy in being used in interpreting our data from the past. So this is, again, the third in our series, establishing whether God exists and looking at least in this case with today's video, looking at one of the biggest objections to the existence of a God, and that is the problem of evil and suffering. That is an issue and a question that has plagued many people throughout history, and I would say it's probably the most fundamental issue in causing people to leave their faith. When they begin to question why God doesn't intervene in some of the horrors and the suffering that we see throughout history. So we're going to take a look at that question today, because it's obviously one that needs to be addressed, because it does stand in the way of many people having faith or believing in a God. If you haven't already seen the first two in this series, the first one being, does God exist? And then the second one, has God revealed himself to mankind? Then go check those out too, because we're trying to establish here that not only is the idea of God not impossible, it's likely very probable, and is very logical. And there is some justification and rationale behind believing in a God and believing that God has in some way interacted with mankind in history. And so that's what our first two videos kind of established. So now we're going to look at this objection, because it's a big one. It's turned a lot of people off from religion, from having a faith in God. It's turned a lot of people away from a previous faith they had in God, as we're going to see in the presentation itself. Okay, so make sure you hit that subscribe button. Make sure you hit the like button on the video. Share this video far and wide. Get it out there. And let's go ahead and jump right into our presentation today. Okay, so we're talking about the problem of evil and suffering. Now, one of the biggest objections that's brought up when one encounters an argument about religion typically is this problem of evil and suffering. Many former Christians, atheists, skeptics, They point to this problem of evil and suffering as being their fundamental reason for why they rejected religion. Uh, in theology, the formal term for it is theodicy. But this is a common argument you find among skeptics and atheists. If you've done any debating or seen any debating on social media, when religion comes up, there's always the person who jumps in and your God's killed millions of babies and murders people, and you'll see that over and over. That is a very, very common argument against religion is that there's evil and suffering in the world. And so a lot of people will use that. Um, Critical Bible scholar and agnostic Bart Ehrman claims this issue is what ultimately caused him to leave Christianity. Bart Ehrman was formerly an evangelical Christian. He was attending seminary to become a pastor. Uh, and during his studies in seminary, he came across, first off, the scholarship relating to the documents of the New Testament and saw the issues that related to that. That created some doubts in his mind, but ultimately he says he left Christianity solely due to this problem here, the problem of evil. Uh, as Ehrman says it, about 9 or 10 years ago, I came to realize that I simply no longer believed the Christian message. A large part of my movement away from the faith was driven by my concern for suffering. We live in a world where a hurricane destroys New Orleans, where a tsunami kills 300,000 people in one fell swoop, where millions of children are born with horrible birth defects. And where is God? So, what exactly then is the problem? How do we define what the problem of evil and suffering? When people make this argument, what is the argument they're making? Well, the problem is this: if God is all powerful, all knowing, and all benevolent, why would he allow suffering and evil to exist? And God being all powerful, all knowing, and all benevolent is typically the standard definition we would give for a God, a pretty basic, fundamental definition of what a God would be. And if a God is all of those things, then that God potentially has the capability to step in and stop all suffering and evil, to stop the Hitlers of the world from doing what they do. So the argument has also been cast as if God's all powerful and he can stop suffering, but he doesn't, then he's evil himself. He himself is no better than Hitler. If he can't stop it, then he's not all powerful. So that's another way in which the argument gets framed. But that is, in essence, the problem of evil as an argument against religion. It's an important question to answer because it is uh, a huge obstacle to many people having a belief in God. And so it's kind of crucial to have an appropriate answer to this problem if we want to see people have a faith in a deity that removes this obstacle from the back of their mind. Before we answer the question, first we have to understand that any satisfactory answer to this question excludes any religion which teaches an eternal damnation or an eternal hell. Only a few religions have taught that there is an eternal damnation in hell that can't be reversed. But that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the idea that at the moment of death, a soul enters into hell, into damnation, and is locked into that state forever and ever and ever, and can never be removed from that state. Now, probably the majority of world religions do not teach an eternal hell or an eternal damnation. It's not, but just a few that do. But the few that do are pretty major religions. First off, being traditional Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant forms of Christianity, to include evangelical and fundamentalist Christianity. That would be probably the largest group today who believes in an eternal hell and an eternal damnation in that hell that will never be reversed and from which a person can never be brought back from. There are some more traditional forms of Islam that also believe in eternal hell. Zoroastrianism, which still exists to a small extent today in Iran, believes in it, and is one of the older religions that has taught an eternal hell and damnation for longer than most other religions. In fact, Christianity itself probably draws most of its ideas about hell from Zoroastrianism. We know that Christianity has quite a few pagan influences, and this would probably be one of them, considering the fact that Judaism does not teach an eternal hell. So Christianity did not draw it from Judaism. So it had to have drawn it from somewhere else. And an eternal hell does exist in Zoroastrianism and did play some role in some of the beliefs of Christianity. Now, the reason eternal hell is an issue is because it creates a situation where some souls cannot ever be reconciled or redeemed in any way. What that does is it negates any beneficial aspects or beneficial outcomes of evil and suffering. Uh, and for us to have a suitable answer to the problem of evil and suffering, we must see how it plays some kind of beneficial role. But if you have an eternal hell, you have a situation where there's one possible outcome for souls where they could suffer throughout life and then at the point of death go to eternal suffering that never ends. And you now have a situation where there are souls which, in essence, have just suffered for their entire existence and will suffer for all of eternity. And there's no purpose to that suffering. Typically, we see suffering, hardship as ways of turning things around and bringing situations to a better standpoint. Uh, that's a beneficial aspect to suffering and hardship. Um, if that's not an aspect of the suffering, if the suffering doesn't serve that purpose, i.e., an eternal hell, people are thrown into it and there's no redeeming benefit. There's no way that people can reach a point where they say, I've had enough. I don't want this anymore. I repent. It doesn't serve that purpose. That they can never achieve that point. And so if we have this outcome in existence, then we have a situation where God has created one possible outcome where people suffer for really no purpose other than to suffer, no purpose other than misery and pain infliction. And this is the idea that skeptics like to jump on, which is the idea of making God into this psychopathic monster who just is this sadistic being that likes to inflict pain on people for all of eternity. And it's a real problem. In this situation, the skeptics and the atheists are right. It does create that situation. It creates a situation where God could not have allowed people to go this route, but he did. And in doing so, he allowed them to go into a suffering that has no benefit to it, which makes God nothing more than a sadistic being who created suffering for people just for the sake of suffering. So that's the problem here. And so, uh, if we have an eternal damnation, we have a situation in which God has created suffering that serves no benefit whatsoever. Because obviously, a God, knowing some people are going to go that route, could have stepped in and not created those people to begin with so they don't go that route. But he did, if he created an eternal damnation, he did create people knowing they were going to go to that destination and did it anyway. So there's nothing positive or beneficial about that at all. This would be the outcome for all of eternity, which this is a typical depiction of hell from a Christian standpoint. Uh, Demons and beings torturing and terrifying people for all of eternity with no rest and no respite. So, uh, this would be evil if this is true. It would be a God that created people solely for the purpose of undergoing this kind of torturous treatment for no reason for all of eternity. Without that, without an eternal hell, we can then begin to look at evil and suffering in a different light. We can see it as a mechanism to facilitate the soul's evolution to a much higher state. In fact, in this instance, it would mirror the environmental pressures that we see in biological evolution, the pressures that drive natural selection. So, if we can envision how hardship, conflict, suffering drives biological evolution, then it's not much of a leap of logic to see that it could also drive spiritual evolution and soul evolution in exactly the same way that it does biological evolution. In the biological realm, we see conflict and environmental pressures driving natural selection to continue improving organisms, making them better fit for their environment. So it plays a beneficial role. In the interim, it does horrifying, terrifying suffering. Uh, but the outcome of that is that the species grows stronger. When the human species undergoes a pandemic, as we did just a few years ago, that pandemic kills a lot of people. Once the species comes through that event, though, the species is now, for the most part, immune to that disease. And that disease no longer poses a threat to that species. So there was a positive benefit that came out of it for the species, and evolution occurred. And so the species became better fit for its environment. In the same way, God could have created this physical realm, this physical universe, as a training ground for souls to evolve. So as they enter into this physical realm, they undergo hardship, they undergo conflict, they undergo suffering, but that leads to the soul evolving into something better and higher. Now, whether that's one lifetime or multiple lifetimes is somewhat irrelevant. If you're in a religion you don't believe in reincarnation, maybe it's just one lifetime. You come here, you go through this, and you leave, and the soul has attained a higher state by doing so. Typically, this would make more sense within a situation where the soul returns multiple times to undergo this process. So it continues to grow higher and higher, where you have reincarnation. As a Jew, uh, my religion believes in reincarnation. So it believes we are going to come here multiple times and undergo this process. And so every time the soul goes through this experience, it's a training ground. And so it returns to this training ground to get better and higher and more enlightened. So that's what the physical realm would be. The hardship would allow souls to go through these experiences and they mold that soul into something better. Ultimately, after undergoing this process multiple times, the souls would eventually achieve a state of redemption and perfection. That would be the ultimate goal. After undergoing this process multiple times, there is a state of blissful experience where they achieve whatever that process may be, perfection, redemption. We see this in multiple religions, Buddhism with its state of nirvana, and so on. So, this is kind of a common theme in a lot of religions that a soul is going through a process to become an enlightened higher being. So, at that point, when the soul reaches that and attains it, those sufferings and hardships that it encountered throughout those lifetimes would be something that at that point they will look back and those things will seem trivial. Kind of see this in our own lives. If you've gone through something hard, you maybe had a job that you worked for 2 or 3 years, and that job was very hard on you, very stressful, and you didn't like being there, and you had a bad boss or whatever. You went through that process, and it was horrible. It was traumatic. It was terrifying. You drug yourself out to go to work every day, and you just dreaded it. 20 years later, you probably look back at that and it seems fairly minor. It doesn't feel anything like it did when you were going through it, um, because you're far removed from that now. And sometimes even you can look back at that and see how it shaped your character and maybe made you into a better person. Um, so the same thing can apply. Just as we look back on some traumatic things and they may not seem as bad now, uh, decades down the road, the same process will likely apply. We'll look back through our multiple lifetimes and see things that we went through that were traumatic experiences, but they evolved our soul and moved it up into a higher plane of existence. I mean, we see the practical use of this kind of suffering even in our own existence in our daily lives. A lot of people will suffer hardships in the short term because they're going to get something better in the long term. We understand this idea. Some examples would be Navy SEAL training, becoming a medical doctor, which is a long, arduous process, astronaut training, things that are positions that people want to aspire to and they want to attain, but getting to them involves, in some cases, particularly Navy SEAL training, very torturous and traumatic experiences to get through to get to that outcome. But people do it. Hundreds of people volunteer for Navy SEAL training every day, even though it's one of the most grueling and brutal experiences on the planet. But people do it. They do it because they're going to attain a fulfillment, a satisfaction that's going to be gained at the end of it, which will annul that suffering that they went through. Same with the doctor training. Doctors go through years of schooling and long hours uh, and interning at hospitals and things like that. So things that are very difficult before they finally become a doctor. But in doing so, and astronauts, the same things, they attain these positions where there's high prestige and there's lots of career satisfaction and there's fulfillment. And in the case of medical doctors, there's lots of money, high earnings. So there's something that's going to be gained. And in gaining that, people are willing to endure some really brutal hardship to get to that. We understand that. And so again, it's something that if we understand it in our own physical existence now, why would it seem so illogical at a higher level, at the soul level, that we would endure these kinds of things, these kinds of hardships that would, in the long run, bring about a better existence? When there's a higher purpose and a positive benefit to enduring hardship, what we know and what we've realized is people will willingly endure that hardship because of the positive outcomes that they're going to attain from it. In other words, when people struggle and they endure hardship to attain something, it has more meaning, it gains more value, and it builds personal character in more positive ways than if that same thing is just given to them freely on a silver platter with no effort. We know that. It's a very basic principle in life. Something you work for, you strive for, and you struggle for has far more meaning and depth to you than something that's just given to you freely. Everybody understands that basic principle. It's not hard to understand that that same principle applies at the development and evolution of our soul. The only thing is that the soul existence, the suffering and hardships, much higher level ones than what we experience here. Hardship and suffering for us would be physical pain, such as in Navy SEAL training and such. At the soul level, it's going to be things like dying and going through traumatic deaths and things like that. But at a soul level, we don't understand that most likely, if there is a much more blissful existence on the other side in another dimension, then death may not be something as horrifying as we see it on this side. Again, not to trivialize death. I'm not doing that. I don't want to make death out to seem as if it's nothing because it is in this existence. When we undergo the death of a loved one, it is a horrifying experience. I've experienced it, and everyone in my audience has experienced it. And it's not fun to go through, and it's not a happy time, and it's a terrible time. But it's not going to seem that way in a higher plane. And just as in a video game that you're playing and suddenly you get shot and killed and you step out of that and reload the game and start a new game, at a higher level, death may be nothing more than that kind of transition. If the outcome of our soul development is ultimately a redemption that brings us into this ecstatic, blissful existence that we can only dream of living in, then at that point, the hardships that we went through in our lives here in the physical realm will be seen as something positive that moved our soul upwards into that position through its evolutionary process. But again, this is only if all souls ultimately attain this. Okay, going back to our point about an eternal hell, if there is an eternal damnation, then this falls apart because then you have some people who are going to suffer forever and ever that could have been stopped or cessated by a God, and they weren't. So that gives us a problem with God that is not resolvable. But if all souls are ultimately going to attain this blissful, redemptive state, then we can understand that God put this into the system as a means of evolving us to that state, and it has a positive, beneficial aspect to it. And God is not a monster at that point. Skeptics like to always point out that, the idea of people dying and children dying and so on, that reality makes God cruel because God could have made a creation without any suffering. I see that all the time, as I said, in debates on social media. I like to always come back with, what would you do as an alternative? Because they're never able to articulate exactly what that kind of creation would look like. If you're not going to have this kind of creation, what kind of creation are you going to have? What's it going to look like? If you have this supposed wisdom that's greater than God's, how would you have done things better? What would a better creation look like that doesn't have these things? Are you going to take out death? Is that what you're going to do? Nobody's going to die? How do you do that? Just a minor thing, which actually would be major after a while. If no one dies, then what do we do in a couple of millennia when the entire planet is overrun with people and there's no way to get rid of them because no one dies? Do you just poof more planets into existence for them? Um, that's just one problem. How do you eliminate and eradicate death in a dynamic existence? Are you going to stop weighted objects from falling? Are people going to be able to walk through a Walmart and a shelf will never fall and things will fall on their head and potentially kill them? Are they not going to have pain? Is there no nervous system where uh, a tractor rolls over someone's foot and crushes all the bones in their foot and they're never aware of it? We have pain for a reason. It alerts us to when we have an injury. When you begin to think through the implications of what such an existence would look like, it begins to become almost foolish. How could you even create such an existence? At least in a physical realm. Now, when we begin to imagine a spiritual realm, possibly without a physical body, then these things likely wouldn't exist because we're not in a physical state with physical laws. But in the state that we exist in now, in a physical universe with laws of physics, it's almost impossible to imagine an alternative where these things don't exist. The laws of physics themselves would almost render such a creation impossible, particularly the second law of thermodynamics, which essentially states that entropy increases throughout the life of the universe, entropy being the state of less available energy. Um, that law itself is an absolute necessity for a changing, evolving universe. If you remove the law of entropy or the second law of thermodynamics, you, in essence, bring the universe to a halt. In fact, the universe would not survive removing the law of entropy from it. It would become a static universe that would be frozen in time. Um, Energy and depletion of energy is required to make a dynamic universe where things thrive and they live and they breathe and they move and they do things. You take that out and you don't have a universe, not anything that looks even anything remotely like what we have today. In fact, this is exactly the same argument that crea- creation scientists make. Um, They've tried to argue that Adam and Eve existed in a state where they didn't die, they couldn't die, and things were blissful. And they claim that that was like that because there was no second law of thermodynamics. That's the argument that they make. But physicists have pointed out that that's a ludicrous argument because there's no way we could have a universe where the second law of thermodynamics doesn't exist. No such universe is possible. Uh, and so, with entropy, what is the universe you're going to imagine that has no death, no suffering? How is that going to exist? Give us an alternative. That would make a static universe where all the processes that are necessary for evolutionary existence, all the processes that occur because of the second law of thermodynamics, decay, digestion of food, reintegration of chemical components, um, all of those things would be unable to operate without a second law of thermodynamics. So skeptics criticize this idea that the universe is evil as it was created by God, but they're never able to articulate a legitimate functioning alternative which would meet their supposed more benevolent standards. What would that universe look like? It's hard to imagine how such a universe could exist. This was implied actually in a scene in The Matrix where Agent Smith tells Morpheus, we attempted to create an original Matrix that was perfect, but humans' brains rejected it. Um, now, that's kind of a little different from the idea of the physics of the universe, and that's speaking more to the psychology of humans. Uh, but in reality, there's probably some truth to that. We are designed and evolved in an environment of hardship and conflict, in an environment of complete comfort and no hardship would actually be very difficult for humans to adapt to. Um, we see that with people who are given everything and they don't have to work for anything, can create a dependency where people literally can't function and have multiple mental issues due to that. So ultimately, the universe was created to provide us with the free choice and the ability for our bodies and souls to evolve in a blissful, redemptive state. Um, you can't have freedom of choice without having the ability to choose wrongly and to choose evil and to choose to do bad things. If that freedom of choice is given to us, by virtue of that, we are going to have evil and suffering. There's no way around that. There's no way to bypass that. So, for whatever reason, God saw this option as the most optimal option for a universe for souls to evolve and to come to a blissful, redeemed state in a perfected state. Why? I don't know, but I would assume that a God has the ability to envision all kinds of different options and would understand what is the most optimal way to bring humans to a state of perfection and redemption, a state of blissful perfection. And maybe this was the best way to do it. We don't know. In the idea that we think we would know a better way, we may not understand fully the consequences of doing it another way, which is why I always bring up what's your perfect universe going to look like? Let's think through the consequences of what that's going to look like, and then you start seeing problems arise. We would have to assume a God would have seen all of these different variations and would have seen the consequences to each one of them and chose, we assume wisely, the best possible. We can't know for sure why God saw this option as better. obviously, but there are plausible reasons that we can speculate. For instance, it's the only way we could have an existence with free will and without being robotic automatons. God could have created a perfect existence with no suffering, but we would have all been robots who did exactly what we were told. It's also the only way we could truly know and appreciate goodness and love because we will have experienced the terrible side of horrific evil and suffering. So once we attain that state of perfection, we will have attained it and have the ability to appreciate it because we will know what the alternative is. Any existence where we were created in a blissful state immediately would not have given us that capability. So in the interim, this universe may seem cruel, harsh, and even horrendous to us. But at some point, assuming that there is a God and assuming that God has a program of bringing us to a blissful state of redemption, uh, there will ultimately come a point in time where we will look back and we will see the purpose for this existence and we'll see that it was a necessity and that it was a benefit for our soul's evolution. So you can see um, that when we especially eliminate the idea of an eternal hell and damnation, eternal damnation, where someone goes and there is no possibility of them ever being redeemed, ever being taken out of that situation. When we remove that, we can actually see a fairly good justification for suffering and hardship and conflict and even evil to some extent playing a role in the evolution of our souls as we attain ever higher levels of enlightenment, of progression in our soul evolution. Um, Again, obviously, with an eternal hell and damnation, uh, that's not the case. Okay, those religions are going to struggle, particularly Christianity, traditional Christianity, are going to struggle with the problem of evil because they have no answer to it. Because a God that condemns people to hell for eternity, when that God doesn't have to do that. I mean, at the very least, he could have just not created those people, foreseeing that they were going to go there, and spare them that suffering. There's no answer to the problem of evil for those religions that believe in an eternal hell. But if there's no eternal hell, as we saw in the presentation, um, suffering, hardship is something that can bring about our enlightenment and our progression in our soul evolution. And so that's what we're trying to establish here today. Okay. Again, hit the like button. Just make sure you spread this video. If you haven't subscribed already, make sure you subscribe. We got more material coming here soon. I'm going to have a video kind of laying out my overall theory that I have in regards to Bible history and archaeology and science and how that has all played out. It's very different than sort of the traditional ways in which religion has interpreted the book of Genesis. And so a lot of it may be new things that you've heard, and hopefully will be things that make more sense than the traditional ways of interpreting those things, and also opens the door to bringing more science in instead of rejecting the science and throwing it all out the window. Okay. So make sure you stay tuned. Make sure you have those notifications on so you can know when we're dropping more videos, and continue to hang on and follow us. We'll see you next time. Thanks.